Splatterhouse was first released as an arcade game back in 1988. Now, I'm pretty sure it was only officially released in Japan, I don't know for sure, but all the manuals and literature I've found have been in Japanese. Now, I'm sure a couple machines popped up in the US, but I still have my doubts. And for those of you saying, well, look at that, that's English, it's typical for a Japanese game to have English text and dialogue. All of Sin and Punishment's spoken dialogue is in English, and that game for sure never came out over here.
There's no time now. Join the troops intercepting the ruffians.
Not counting Virtual Console, I know, shut up. So it's safe to say that most of us first discovered Splatterhouse when it was released on the TurboGrafx 16 in 1990. In fact, this was the only version to come out in North America, meaning that the unlockable arcade original in the new Splatterhouse is probably the first official American release. Now for fun, I thought I'd take you through the two ports to show just how different the arcade original and the TurboGrafx versions are. If you want to hear my thoughts on the other games in this series, go check out my other videos. And on a side note, since my first Splatterhouse video, a number of fine reviews for the Famicom spin-off Wampako Graffiti have popped up, so go ahead and check out one of those. I don't see any point in reviewing it anymore. Now, a warning. I'm not joking around here. We're about to get super nerdy on some Splatterhouse. We're going through the whole game here. There's gonna be spoilers. So if you don't want these games spoiled for you, shut the video off now and run to your local store and pick up a copy of the new Splatterhouse. Certain versions of the game come with a code that unlock the classic games right away. If you can't find a version with a code, don't worry, you unlock them pretty quickly. Without getting into how I feel about the reboot, the original 3 games are definitely worth at least $40. And by the time most of you see this video, Splatterhouse will have dropped in price. Alright, before we get started proper, I want to clear up something. I mentioned this in my original review, but I maybe wasn't as clear as I could have been. The TurboGrafx port of Splatterhouse was not censored. The Japanese version was not any more gory than the American version. The only differences were the color of the mask, to avoid copyright problems I'm sure, and the 4th level boss, where all the religious imagery was removed. And I guess that counts as censorship fine, but this version is just as bloody and violent as the Japanese version. The reason the TurboGrafx and PC Engine versions were so toned down was because of hardware limitations. Arcade machines were way more powerful than home consoles back then, and 2 8-bit processors couldn't do this game justice. Okay, so first off, Arcade Splatterhouse has much more story. If you let the title screen sit for a bit, we see an intro where Rick and Jennifer enter the mansion. Start the game, you'll see another short movie where the mask floats above Rick's presumably dead body and attaches itself to his face. In the TurboGrafx port, there's only a simple shot of the house. It sets the mood, but never made any sense to me as a kid. Okay, there's a house. That must be the Splatterhouse. It's worth noting the cabin is missing from this shot. Level 1. Right away you can see what I mean when I said arcades were much more powerful back then. In the TurboGrafx port, level 1 is just a barren, empty cave. In the arcade version, it's the cave happiness and good feelings forgot. It's like night and day. The spikes and bats are still there, so all the main obstacles are left the same. Your first weapon in the arcade is a cleaver, and later a 2x4. In the TurboGrafx port, it only has the 2x4. Probably because they couldn't animate heads being cut off. Again, not really censorship, probably just hardware limitations. The first boss is essentially the same, but is a little harder because there's more places for the Boroworms to pop out of. You can still pretty much just stand in the corner. Man, isn't it awesome Night of the Creeps finally came out on DVD? Gotta love that movie.
Thrill me.
Level 2 was just like the first, significantly more gory. Just look at this shit, God I love this game. This is also a good time to point out how impressive the soundtrack was for the arcade. So we're listening to the arcade music right now. And this is the TurboGrafx. Arcade. TurboGrafx. One thing I noticed, the first level ended with a worm bursting out of one of those hanging things, and the second level has a trap door at the start. I'm assuming this guy here was hanging off of the door there. So after Rick died, he was not only thrown in the cabin, but in the basement cellar of the cabin. This detail is absent in the Turbo port. I told you we were getting nerdy, folks. The only thing worth mentioning here is, again, no cleaver in the Turbo port, only the 2x4. Not much to say about the water part or the poltergeist boss. They're pretty much the same, so let's move on to the next level. Level 3 is the outside path to the house. Not too much to talk about here either. The arcade is a little messier, there's a couple of rotting corpses here and there, but it's a pretty tame environment compared to the first 2 levels. There's renegade birds in the arcade version, there's your Hitchcock reference, and there's trees and bushes that hide a couple of rocks from view. One big change here is the TurboGrafx port uses the song from the first level again. We'll come back to that in a bit. The shotgun trick is still a must here because one of the toughest bosses in the game is guarding the entrance to the house. Biggie Man, the towering burlap sack-wearing dual chainsaw-wielding fan favorite. If you don't think this guy right here is fucking awesome, I don't think you and I can be friends. Splatterhouse fans demanded that Biggie Man be brought back for the remake. In fact, it was one of the first things I remember hearing confirmed. Here's a small detail. When you defeat Biggie Man in the TurboGrafx port, he's reduced to nothing, but in the arcade version, he just simply falls over. His chainsaws don't even stop running. We were all waiting for the rematch, but it would unfortunately be 20 years before we got a chance to settle the score with our terrifying friend. Level 4, the house. Much like with level 3, there's only subtle differences to the graphics. The house is a bit decrepit and there's a couple of bodies thrown about. It's nothing we haven't seen before. In the TurboGrafx port, the house is pristine by comparison. One thing I'll say is they really nailed the song down in the port. I almost prefer the TurboGrafx version of the arcade. Not too much to say about the Hall of Mirrors. When you defeat your doppelgangers in the arcade version, they're reduced to dust, whereas in the Turbo port, they just blink and disappear. Yeah, not too much to talk about here. Let's move on. The boss. This is the only place in the TurboGrafx port where we see the cleaver. In the arcade version, it was the only time we saw an axe. In fact, this is the only time we see an axe in the entire series. I'm pretty sure, at least. Another thing I've noticed is the boss is a lot tougher in the Turbo port. The masks off-screen fly in at a really awkward time and angle. It gives it a nice challenge instead of being a total pushover like he is in the arcade version. And I'm sure you noticed this is the boss who was an inverted cross in all versions except the American TurboGrafx port. Furthermore, the crosses on the arches and the altar have also been removed. But for whatever reason, the candles and the church hymn were not. So when you kill the evil mask in the Turbo port, you're treated to a completely out-of-place song and floating candles. Also, Jennifer's scream is missing in the home ports, so this sudden swell of music is meaningless and kind of funny. Level 5, Jennifer. Before we start the actual level, I want to point out this little piece of music. Remember how Level 3 reused Level 1's theme instead of using the track from the arcade? Well, this little piece is a reworking from that song, used to much greater effect between levels. Here, listen. Do you hear it? Now let's compare. I personally think the piece in the TurboGrafx port is much more effective, especially if you know what's coming. This level may be the longest in the game. It goes like this. You first start off in a room with chairs, then a room with jumping hands and tilted floors, then you get to choose your own path for the next 3 screens. I want to talk about the room with the necromancer. In the arcade version, I swear he's saying, "I'm grooving." Yeah, and why wouldn't he be? Listen to that song. Shit, I'd be grooving too if my girl wasn't in trouble. And speaking of which, let's jump ahead to the boss fight because there's a lot to talk about there. Now, I'm sure I don't have to explain this part to you because I already spoiled the shit out of this scene a few years back. Sorry about that. Anyway, there's a little controversy over what exactly Jennifer is saying here. My darling or I'm dying? I think she's saying my darling because I can hear an L. Also, I'm dying doesn't make much sense logically because up to this point, she's just woken up and seen her man. She doesn't know what's about to happen. She's happy and relieved and shouts, "Oh, my darling!" Then this happens. Oh man, my life was changed forever when I saw that when I was 12 years old. But let's watch the arcade version. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Cruel, disturbing, vile, and great fucking storytelling. Now here's where my preference is split. human Jennifer's cries of pain and her mutant form's maniacal laugh in the arcade version still give me shivers, especially when she screams and laughs at the same time in the beginning. Ugh. And this song's driving, pounding bass ratchets up the tension. It's an amazing fight that the turbo port just doesn't do justice, except for one huge difference. The fight with Jennifer has 3 parts, and between each one she reverts back to her human self, just long enough to speak for a moment. And in the turbo port, Jennifer very clearly pleads, "Help me." That's right, help me. She doesn't cry out in pain or laugh maniacally, but that tiny plea is so effective. In the arcade version, I have absolutely no idea what she's saying. What? Huh? I think she's saying, "Oh, help me," but it sounds more like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." I'm really torn over which version I prefer, but you know when it comes down to it, this moment is pretty much the reason why I love Splatterhouse. So why be picky? Now here's an important thing to note. When you kill Jennifer, she dies in different ways in each version. In the turbo port, she crumbles to dust in your arms. In the arcade version, she chillingly thanks you, then says goodbye, and her body, or perhaps her soul, whisks away. This is important because in Splatterhouse 2, we learn that Jennifer is actually still alive. In fact, you travel to the depths of some horrible dimension to save her. Now that's romantic. This is either because it's just her body the monster's deflowered, not her soul, which is now trapped in another dimension, or that wasn't Jennifer at all, and her body and soul are in another dimension. Either way, she's gone now, and Rick has unfinished business, so he jumps down a hole, which is way more gross looking in the arcade version. Level 6, the Heart. Not much to say about this level, it's still a pain in the ass. It's a good thing to point out that the controls in the TurboGrafx port are a lot more precise. Rick just seems to move a little more sluggish in the arcade, and having that turbo switch is really helpful. Oh, but watch out, in the arcade version, the heart spews harmful waste at you when it dies. In the turbo port, it just explodes and disappears, kinda like in Contra. The final level, level 7. This level is short, but there's only a few minor differences here, like the fire guys flail in the arcade, and you arrive at a cross instead of a tombstone. There's that missing religious imagery again. Here the boss moans every so often in the arcade version, but remains silent on the TurboGrafx. Both versions pull out all the stops to make whatever the hell this thing is beautifully detailed in all its disgusting glory. Now, it's never really explained what or who exactly this is you're fighting, and why the mask summoned him. Either way, there's not much more to talk about here, so let's move on to the ending. Once the final boss has been defeated, a giant ghost-like face rises from the ground and explodes with white energy. In the arcade, we see the image of Rick walking away from the burning house when the mask shatters off his face. After sitting through one of the most beautiful and depressing songs ever written, we pan down to see the mask reform and laugh distressingly. In the turbo port, we just see a close-up of the mask shattering into white pieces, interesting, followed by the image of the house burning to the ground. Again, we're treated to an incredibly moving song, concluding with the word end. I remember being so pissed off at how ambiguous this ending was when I first played it, I spent the rest of my day beating the game on hard mode just to see if there would be a different ending. And man was I pissed when I found out that there wasn't one. Not only that, I was confused as all hell when I got my hands on the second game. The mask was back, the house was back, Jennifer was back. It would have made a little more sense if I had known about the arcade version, but there was no internet back then, so how was I supposed to know? Okay, well, that's about all I have to say about Splatterhouse. Well, I mean, I could go on. I fucking love these games. But I think I've said enough for now. There's actually a ton of stuff I didn't go over, but that's why they invented encyclopedias and fan sites. If you want to know more about Splatterhouse, the West Mansion has been the place since before I even started making videos. Alright, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed getting super nerdy with some Splatterhouse. Thanks for watching.